What do we do when the pain of the past is too much to bear? When trauma and shame overwhelm us? When we feel empty and worthless despite our success and our daily triumphs? We rise above our story. Author Karena Kilcoyne will be speaking tonight at the Oxford Exchange, but she joins us now on Tampa Bay Reads to talk about her new release, Rise Above Your Story. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Linda. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, so tell us about your story. What inspired you to write this book?
I had a very traumatic childhood, and I stuffed my shame and trauma for decades, and I went on to become a successful lawyer. But even so, I felt worthless and empty. Like, why did I feel so empty when I had so much? So I went on a healing journey, and I learned a lot of really interesting things about how I wasn't alone in my pain or my trauma. 70% of us will experience trauma, and therefore I wanted to write a book to help people, to give them a guidebook.
I like that because you're actually going to teach your readers 3 important things, probably many more, but at least 3. So let's talk about those. The first thing you need to do to heal is what? Acknowledge your story, acknowledge the trauma?
Acknowledge your story. It's so important. It's where I started. First of all, it's like you have to want to heal. And second of all, it's this self-awareness that you have experienced a trauma and that you are also then have a story about it. So acknowledging that and understanding that you are telling yourself, your brain has created for you because of your trauma, a false story to keep you safe. So I distill the brain science because if you want to heal, you really need to understand the science of how your brain works in the face of trauma.
So you've been surviving, but now it's time to untangle that, right? So how do you untangle your story?
That's a really important step, and I go through this in the book in great detail, but for me it involved a lot of forgiveness of others, forgiveness of myself. So many of us trauma survivors don't forgive ourselves, and that takes a while to do that. Also a lot of inner child work. And then understanding how you got so tangled up in your story in the first place. For me, it was recurrent trauma and the multi-generational transfer of trauma. So things that your parents went through and your grandparents went through, and then that story continues generation to generation, abandonment and violence. And until you understand those stories, that's how you stop that transfer of trauma.
And then you say rise above your story. What does that mean exactly, rise above it?
Rise above it is 2 steps, and it's really finding that silver lining. There's something you could be grateful for, something that came out of it that was good. You moved, you got a new job, you learned something new, you met a new friend. And so those are the silver linings we look for in trauma. And the second part of rising above your story is learning to finally love ourselves. And that's really challenging if you are a survivor of trauma. Oftentimes that's not the natural thing, is to love and respect yourself. And that comes with finding compassion for what you've been through and what you did to survive, and knowing that all of those things are something to be proud of and nothing to be ashamed of.
I think it's more open to talk about that you're not so perfect, right? Even though, like you said, you were a lawyer and you had this perfect persona out in the public.
Yes.
Is that another reason why you wrote the book? Because you think people are more receptive now to saying, I need to do some work on me?
I want to normalize talking about trauma and this idea, these stories, right? Because we all have a story, or 100.
Right.
We're too this, we're not enough that, we could be this, but we're not. And so I really want to normalize talking about it, because I feel like when we do that, we lift ourselves up out of shame and we realize we aren't alone. So many of us get caught up thinking we're alone in our pain and our shame, and we're not.
We only have about 30 seconds, so I know you can't go into too much detail, but you also talk about the neuroscience of the brain, right?
Yes. So it's very complex, right, brain science, but in my book I distill it down to 2 parts of the brain, the emotional brain and the thinking brain. The emotional brain is very like your heartbeat, your temperature, your fight or flight response. Your thinking brain is your self-awareness, your compassion. What happens when we experience trauma and we don't process it, we get looped into the emotional brain and nothing is sent upstairs to the thinking brain. So we're caught in this fear loop, this loop of like, don't take a risk, don't do this. We need to start thinking in self-awareness and compassion, and this self-awareness step of like, I understand who I am in this whole process, and I have compassion for that.
Do you consider yourself happy now, and what is your definition of happiness?
Happiness is definitely a journey for me, and I feel like my happiness comes from this emotional freedom I have found in healing, and that is I am no longer tethered to the past. And I understand that I am empowered and I have healed myself.
And now you're giving to others.
And I want to do that for others. That's what I'm here to do, is to spread the word that we all have the power to heal ourselves.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Linda.
Well, Karena will be leaving Fox and going right to the Oxford Exchange to celebrate her book launch and take questions from readers. And if you'd like to join her, you can go to the link you see there on your screen. Karena's book is available on Amazon and on her website. It's called riseabovethestory.com.